Civilians. In some ways, we started our discussion about Newmarket by talking about civilians. We talked about the town, because the town existed before the battle came. And it seems appropriate to start wrapping up our series with a discussion or focus on civilians, because the reality is the town stayed, the civilians stayed after the armies left. And this brings us to a chapter, if you will, of Newmarket's aftermath history. What happened after the fighting ended, in the immediate days, in the care for the wounded, and as the decades went by, how did Newmarket as a community remember the battle, and how has that shaped our understanding of this fight that occurred on May 15th, 1864 in the Shenandoah Valley. I'm Sarah K. Byerly with Gazette 66.5, and today I invite you to join us for a discussion of Newmarket's civilians and the after-story of Newmarket's battle. I could talk about civilians all day long. Ask my mom. Even if I'm studying a military officer or a battle, one way or another I will find a way to find out something about civilians tied to the history, and then I'll talk someone's ear off about that. So, I decided that I wanted to be purposeful, as concise as possible, as we talk about civilians and this after story of Newmarket. So I'm actually going to talk about 3 civilian women. Some of them we've talked about before. But let's talk about what they did immediately after the battle, and then we'll take it further as the decades went on and how they were part of this continuing history of Newmarket and how the Civil War was remembered. So let's start off with Eliza Klinedinst Krim. She was Eliza Klinedinst at the time of the battle. Her family and friends called her Lydie. And she lived on Congress Street, which is the main street going through Newmarket. We mentioned her in our discussion about Shirley's Hill. After the war, Lydie Klinedinst married, and her married name, Krim, is how you will find her if you are looking for her grave in the cemetery in Newmarket. So let's go ahead and take a look at the video that we shot at her gravesite a couple years ago. So not only did Lydie Klinedinst play a role in the immediate aftermath of the battle, but she has a role that continues on. She stays in contact with the VMI cadets. Now their experiences, the cadets' experiences at Newmarket, were going to tie the school to Newmarket and its history forever. But she also ensures that the civilian voice, the civilian part of the story, is not lost. And her care, as her mother opened the home to care for Cadet Jefferson, that starts to cement civilians into the recorded history and the memory of Newmarket. And Lydie Klinedinst was very happy to take on that role of bringing a civilian side. She took her role, her name as mother of the Newmarket cadets very seriously. She was the only civilian to receive the Newmarket Medal of Valor, which she wore very proudly as a connection to the history and the Institute. As Newmarket remembered battle history, Lydie Klinedinst became a local celebrity. People would come to battle anniversaries or battle reunions, and they wanted to see her. They wanted to hear her story. And she lived into the 20th century. She was present when monuments were dedicated at the battlefield. She spoke to veterans of both sides, Confederate Union, cadets. She was a woman who helped to say to people, to say to her community and to those who visited, the battle that happened here matters. And she helped to define that both for the military in some ways, but also ensuring that that civilian side of the story would be present as well. I'm standing here at the grave marker of Eliza Klinedinst Krim. Actually, I'm standing beside the family grave marker, the Krim family grave marker. If you're visiting the site, be sure to look behind this large headstone and you'll see the flat gravestone for Eliza herself. Again, that's if you're visiting here. From this angle, it's just a better way to shoot the video this morning. I wanted to talk about Eliza Klinedinst Krim because she plays an important part at the Battle of Newmarket and in the memory of Newmarket. During the battle, she looked out from her back porch, and in later years she said that she saw the Virginia Military Institute Corps of Cadets moving down Shirley Hill. So she's seeing this from her civilian home in town. And she later said that she saw the shell that exploded near the Corps as they were marching down and how the lines formed back together. And she initially thought that the French had come. She saw that big white flag from the Virginia Military Institute and was convinced that French reinforcements had arrived. She's one of the first Newmarket civilians to venture out onto the battlefield to provide aid to the wounded soldiers. And it seems like she went to the Shirley Hill area where some of the first casualties suffered by the VMI Corps were located. We do know that after the battle, VMI cadet Moses Ezekiel brings his dying friend, Cadet Thomas Garland Jefferson, to the Klinedinst home, and Eliza helps to care for Jefferson in his last days. She also writes a letter to Jefferson's mother. Experiences like this, as well as others, made Eliza feel very close to the Newmarket cadets. And she stays in contact with them through the rest of her life, writing letters, telling them about commemorations and things that happened in Newmarket when the monuments were erected toward the end of the 19th century or into the 20th century. She's writing to them, telling them what's happening. And the Battle of Newmarket, her interactions with the Newmarket cadets, play a large role in her life. Now, Eliza Klinedinst Krim received an honorary medal from VMI, and she was known as Mother Krim, or Mother of the Newmarket Cadets. Now, across the street from the Klinedinst home stood the residence of Solomon and Jessie Rupert, the Unionists in the town of Newmarket. So predictably, after the fighting ended, the Ruperts were concerned that the wounded Union soldiers left behind, and there were many, they were not able to take all of their wounded with them in the retreat. They were concerned that these men would not get adequate care, either because of the sympathies of the local civilians or because the Confederate doctors who remained behind were going to be so overworked taking care of the Southern injured. So the Ruperts go out and they start bringing in wounded Union soldiers, getting them out of the rain, trying to get them into shelter, trying to make them comfortable, bandage wounds, petition medical men to come and look after them. Mrs. Rupert ends up a little bit at her wit's end. She is out of room in her house, in her school. They've been putting Union wounded in one of the churches, and yet it's raining. She needs to get more of these guys out of the elements. She petitions one of her neighbors to please open up one of his warehouses that we think was mostly empty, just to have a place to get these wounded soldiers, in some shelter. And the neighbor, he was determined to be very Southern in his views. He was not going to help his Unionist neighbor or these enemy soldiers that were still in the community, so he refuses to open his warehouse. So Jessie is a bit desperate, and she sees a captain, Confederate captain, and a group of infantry coming either up or down the street. And she goes and she stands in the middle of this muddy road and she makes an appeal. She appeals to this officer's humanity, and she explains the situation and that there are wounded enemy soldiers in need of shelter. And he listens, and he then orders some of his men to go and just tear this warehouse open so that she will have a place to shelter what would have been his enemy soldiers. So she plays a big role in taking care of what could have been a forgotten group or maybe neglected group of men, injured men, who had been left behind after the battle fighting and the retreat. Jessie's actions following the Battle of Newmarket did not endear her any further to her neighbors. but they did endear her to Union soldiers. And men of the 34th Massachusetts Regiment remembered her kindness in taking care of them, and they would later name her Daughter of their Regiment, which was a title that she wore with great honor and distinction, in a similar way that Lady Klinedinst accepted the title of Mother of the Newmarket Cadets. So you have these women in the Newmarket community that, because of their compassion, because of what they did, they are written into the military side of the story, but they also help the military remember the civilian side of the story as well, and that can be a key point. Mrs. Rupert ends up a little bit at her wit's end. She is out of room in her house, in her school. They've been putting Union wounded in one of the churches, and yet it's raining. She needs to get more of these guys out of the elements. She petitions one of her neighbors to please open up one of his warehouses that we think was mostly empty, just to have a place to get these wounded soldiers, in some shelter. And the neighbor, he was determined to be very Southern in his views. He was not going to help his Unionist neighbor or these enemy soldiers that were still in the community, so he refuses to open his warehouse. So Jessie is a bit desperate, and she sees a captain, Confederate captain, and a group of infantry coming either up or down the street. And she goes and she stands in the middle of this muddy road and she makes an appeal. She appeals to this officer's humanity, and she explains the situation and that there are wounded enemy soldiers in need of shelter. And he listens, and he then orders some of his men to go and just tear this warehouse open so that she will have a place to shelter what would have been his enemy soldiers. So she plays a big role in taking care of what could have been a forgotten group or maybe neglected group of men, injured men, who had been left behind after the battle fighting and the retreat. Now there's one other civilian woman that I would like to mention, and that is Sarah Michonne. So she was a grandmother at the time of Newmarket. She lives in the house that stood at the center of a lot of the fighting at Newmarket. Remember the Michonne lines? Well, they're named after her farm. Well, her husband's farm, but her family's farm. And her house is taken over as a field hospital. But she does something very significant. She starts making a record of the men who are wounded and lying in the hallways, her parlors, her porch. She starts recording their names. And she also starts writing down if they passed away, which men had died, when they died, things like that. And that became very important as relatives come to Newmarket seeking to find loved ones who may have been wounded or killed. So she plays a role there in this care of the wounded. She's there involved in the medical care, but she's also starting a written record of what happened and who was at her house when it was used as a field hospital. Now the Michonne family continued to own the property for many years, and toward the end of the 19th century, one of the first monuments to be erected at Newmarket Battlefield was placed with the help and permission of Michonne family members, and that is the pile of stones, or the rustic pier as it is called, dedicated to the memory of Woodson's Missourians. Remember, they were the exile unit, guys from Missouri who had been taken prisoner, released in a prisoner exchange in Virginia, and decided to fight in the Eastern Theater of the war. So some of Woodson's Missourians veterans came back and they asked permission to place a stone marker at their battle position, which was still on Michonne land. And the family agreed and actually helped to place this monument. So again, we find civilian members of the Michonne family helping to record history of what happened on their land. So it's another example of the local community or local family realizing the importance of what happened and taking a step to ensure that its memory would not fade. I mentioned it briefly how Mrs. Krim was involved at monument dedications and battle reunions. Um, as decades passed and interest revived in the American Civil War, and these veterans were now older, time had gone by, they wanted to remember, write about, reminisce about the things they had done during the war, battles they had fought in. Interest started centering in on Newmarket Battle, especially for former cadets and soldiers who had fought there. There were big reunions. There were actually early battle reenactments that happened in Newmarket. You have men who had fought on both sides coming together for commemorations, monument dedications, and all of this fosters memory, a chance to tell a story. But telling it orally does not always ensure that it is recorded. And we are very fortunate that a man named Benjamin Colonna helped to ensure that Newmarket's stories, their primary sources, got recorded. Benjamin Colonna had been a captain in the Virginia Military Institute Corps of Cadets. He went on to have a very successful career in surveying and engineering. And in his later years, he had this deep interest in getting the history of the Battle of Newmarket correct. He wanted to understand exactly what the Corps of Cadets had accomplished and make sure that that would be recorded for history and for future generations to learn about. One of the ways that he went about that was he started writing letters. And he wrote to comrades who had been with him at Virginia Military Institute and on those battle lines, and then he started expanding. He starts writing to veterans of Confederate units. He starts writing to Union veterans, and he's saying, if you were at Newmarket, tell me what you did. Where was your unit? What time did these certain things happen? To the best of your recollection, what happened at Newmarket? Colonna's correspondence, much of it, is preserved at VMI's archives. And as you go through it, you find that his correspondence, his asking for these stories and history, produced files and files of primary source accounts of the battle. Not everything always adds up. And part of that is because as decades go by, memories change. It can be harder to remember things. But also, it serves to show that Civil War battles, and in this case, Newmarket in particular, were experienced in different ways by the soldiers. And it's probably something that we go, oh yeah, of course, we know that. Everyone has a different experience of something. But when you then have them record it, then to a historian you're like, well, this person says this, and this person says this, and how do we make them add up? And sometimes, when we get enough pieces, a new image or a clearer image of a fight can emerge. Other times, you're left wondering, and other times when things just do not add up with other accounts, you start to wonder if it could have been a problem with remembering. But it is fascinating to go through what these men thought and what they remembered of this battle that in many cases had happened 50 years prior to their writing about it. In many ways, Colonna's quest for information came from the Confederate Veteran magazine, which had published a couple of articles about the Battle of Newmarket, and it sparked a big debate. How many cannons did the cadets capture? How quickly did the Union Army go into retreat? Just things that opened big debate. And you had men, usually cadets, who were writing into the magazine and saying, well, you got this wrong in this article, and I was there, and here's the reason why. And eventually, Colonna and others realized that these type of debates could not go on endlessly in the Confederate Veteran magazine. So then they started saying, all of us who were there, why don't we start talking to each other? It becomes, in some ways to the public eye, what I refer to as memory wars. You have guys going back and forth in these Southern publications, Confederate veteran publications, and they're saying, well, I remember it this way, and I remember it this way, and it goes back and forth, and finally, Colonna writes to him and says, now, hang on, what do you say, how does that fit into this map that I'm creating of Newmarket Battle? And because they were so passionate about how they were remembered, we have this treasure trove of information. And that is something that we can be grateful for. A lot of smaller battles in the Civil War, documentation can be difficult. You end up looking for official reports. Sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. And then you start combing through soldiers' journals, maybe a civilian account here or there, trying to piece together what happened. We are so fortunate when we look at the Battle of Newmarket that it is one of the best documented files of primary sources on this smaller battle, smaller scale battle. And much of that has to do with the memory wars, remembrances, and how the veterans who fought there wanted the fight to be remembered. Well, we're coming to the end of our video series on the Battle of Newmarket. I suppose there are a lot of other things that I could tell you about the battle. I would encourage you to stay tuned on the blog, because I'll probably do some more writing there or over at Emerging Civil War on the battle. If you have not got a copy of the newest book on the Battle of Newmarket, Call Out the Cadets, it is available on at Gazette 665 store through Savas Beatty Military History Press, Amazon, and all major booksellers. So that would be a great way to take the Newmarket discussion and education to the next level. And then when you're done with Call Out the Cadets, you'll want to pick up Valley Thunder by Charles Knight. And if that's not enough, send me an email, leave a comment, and I can definitely recommend some more resources. There will be a couple more videos in this series before we say goodbye, because we definitely want to tell you about battlefield preservation at Newmarket, and then we'll do some concluding thoughts where I will share a little bit more of what Newmarket has come to mean to me. I know in the beginning of the series I told you the inspiration behind the book, but let me take it a couple steps further and tell you a little more about what Newmarket means to me after doing this study, and also finding more things that I want to research in the saga of this town and battlefield in the Shenandoah Valley. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Sarah K. Byerly with Gazette 665. I hope you have a wonderful and inspired week, and we will see you again soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.